So I just wanted to record a quick tutorial to show how to bring architectural models into Unreal Engine in order to view in virtual reality. So generally we model things in something like Vectorworks, Blender or Sketchup, and then bring them into Unreal Engine for texturing and lighting. There are some very simple modeling tools in Unreal Engine, but really the ideal thing is to model it in another program and then bring it into Unreal Engine. So when Unreal Engine's a free download, and when you open it, it comes up with this Epic Games launcher. You start with this community section, which is just a whole load of articles on Unreal Engine, including some here about architectural visualization. You also have the Learn section, which is full of various different tutorials. And then the marketplace, which is where you can buy various assets such as, well, a lot of games assets, but you can also buy things specific to architecture with furniture or materials or something. When you've created a project, they'll appear here, but if you want to create a new project, you click Launch here, and that will load this Launch dialog box, which will start on the project. I tend to select New Project and then go to the Virtual Reality template. Then down here, set it to desktop, maximum quality, and I tend to include the starter content, which will bring some materials and things into Unreal Engine by default. You then click Project. So after you've done that, this template screen will load. So this is one that I've previously done before. Here's where you have all the folders for your specific game. So these are all the folders contained within the game. Some of these, like the virtual reality and the starter content, will have come through in that template. Some of these other ones I've imported from the Unreal Marketplace, and I've also created this MHW content folder for all the content which I'm going to bring in specifically for us. So I'll just call this test for the moment for what I'm going to bring in. Click here and then right click and say import. And so this is actually here, this is the FBX file I've created earlier from Vectorworks, so I'm going to click that and open it, and we then get this dialog box for the FBX import. It might be that this hasn't been expanded yet when you import it, so if it comes in like this, first thing to do is to make sure that auto generate collision is being ticked. And if it hasn't already dropped down, click this button here to drop down the additional items. The things that you want to do is you want to click this Generate Light Map UVs. So basically what this does is create a second set of UVs for baking your shadows onto. So normally when you have a piece of rendering software, you use UV editing in order to say how textures are wrapped around your objects. So in Unreal Engine, you also need to paint shadows onto the surface of your objects in order to allow for the real-time rendering. So you can either generate those UVs in your software such as Blender or 3D Studio Max, but it's a little bit complicated, and if you're bringing it more from something like Vectorworks, which doesn't allow you to edit the UVs, then you'll want to generate the light map UVs here. You also want to uncheck this combine meshes, so it brings it in as a series of separate meshes. I tend to get these kind of various different error messages bringing it in from Vectorworks. I tend to ignore them and it tends to be okay. So I'm going to come up here to File and then say New Level and click on that the default, and then this appears here, and what you'll have in here is you'll have a lighting system, you'll have a bit of atmospheric fog. This is the skylight, which is doing the kind of more ambient lighting. This is collecting the reflections here, and then this is where you're going to start on the screen, and then it's just got a default ground plane. So if I click on all those meshes that I've just imported, select them all and drag them into the scene, then they appear here. If I also go up to here in the Details tab and tap 0, 0, 0 into the location. And then for some reason, coming from Vectorworks, it tends to bring the meshes in 10 times the size they should be. So in here I tend to put 0.1, a scale factor of 0.1 in all directions to bring it down to the right scale. So here you can see this very simple room that we brought in, and what we now need to do is texture this. So you can come down to the Materials tab here and say display the materials. So these are materials that I set up in Vectorworks, but I now need to apply the Unreal Engine equivalent materials to this object. So in the starter content that we put into the file to begin with, and under materials you should have a collection of materials like this. You can then drag the ones that you want to onto these material slots. So here was the wood that I'd used in Vectorworks. So if I get the wood from Unreal Engine and drop it into there, the wood should appear on the outside here where I've set it. And similarly with the glass, you can grab this glass and put it onto the glass material here, and that will then turn to the glass. So yeah, quite nice and simple. We brought the materials into Unreal Engine. We brought the mesh and applied the materials in Unreal Engine. I'm just actually going to apply the material to that ground floor as well. So the next thing we need to do is we need to put in our virtual reality player. So you do this through here, through the virtual reality blueprint, and go to blueprints. So blueprints are little bits of script, bits of coding that determine how the game plays and how you can interact with the game. So this is something that's preset in the virtual reality template. You want this motion controller pawn in the virtual reality blueprint folder under blueprints, and bring that into the game and have it intersecting with your ground plane. So when you basically pick up the headset of the HTC Vive or the Oculus Rift, your eye height will be relative to the floor. So to start with, you want the camera on the floor. We also need to click here and click to where it says auto possess player, put that to player 0. So that just means when it loads and the sort of game starts, or the architectural visualization starts, the first player to enter the game, which will always be 1 to begin with, is going to occupy that camera. Next thing we need to do is define where the player is allowed to roam within the model. So we go to here to volumes, nav mesh bounds volume, and drag that into the game here. And then using this scale tool, we want to change the scale so that cube encompasses all the places that we'd like to be able to go and move around in the game. So as default, when you bring meshes into Unreal Engine and using the default setting, it will use a very simple shape to determine determine the physics of the game and what walls you can hit into and where you can walk through and where you can't. So say this wall, if we just drag this out a little bit, this wall initially will be represented by a cube, and the game won't understand that there's a door in there, so you won't actually be able to get through it. So what we need to do is go back to where we imported our meshes, select them all, and we then need to go into Asset Actions and then bulk edit via Property Matrix, and then type in here collision. And what we want to do is change this collision complexity to use complex collision as simple. So this basically means that it will recognize more complex shapes, such as the doorways in walls and things, when it's calculating the collisions or where you can walk and where you can't walk. So once you've done that, you close that. So now we've set up our volume where we're allowed to walk. We've made all the meshes so that their collision complexity is set to complex as simple. and we should be ready then to play the game. So you come up here, and I haven't got a headset connected to the computer at the moment, but in here you click on VR preview, which should be lit up if you've got the VR headset attached, and you'll then be able to play the game. Yeah, so that's it. It's kind of, though it's quite a complex bit of software, that's a very simple way of bringing an FBX file into Unreal Engine in order to view in virtual reality. Now, if you want to improve the rendering in the game, this initially, when you bring it in, is just going to have a very simple form of shadow and shading. So to make that more complex, we can actually come up here, we can go to lighting quality, we can say production here, and then if we also go to a lighting info, I don't think we need to change anything there. And what we're going to do is click build here. So what this is now doing is it's kind of calculating the shadows in a more complex way, and it's then going to bake those shadows onto the surfaces of our objects using the UV maps that were generated when we initially brought the model into Unreal Engine. If that sounds a little bit complicated, there are various other videos that go into more detail about how that works. But basically, some of the shading we're calculating just once, painting it as a sort of layer onto the objects, so that it's then baked onto those objects, which means we can then view that more complicated shading, which in a lot of other computer rendering programs would take much longer to calculate for each frame, so it might take a matter of hours to calculate for a frame. This has now been done instantaneously and can be viewed at sort of the required 90 frames a second for virtual reality shading. So once that's finished, we're getting some errors here about overlapping UVs. So it's not always perfect when you bring it in using this sort of slightly more simplified technique. And so generally it's sort of quite good here, and we're getting more complex shadows with it being darker in the corners. But we're also getting a few errors. So here, this shadowing doesn't look quite right. And that's kind of one of the downsides of just very simply bringing an FBX mesh into Unreal Engine and just clicking the auto generate UVs, is sometimes it doesn't get those right. If you want to do something more complex, you're going to have to bring it into a more complex modeling package such as Blender or 3D Studio Max, and then automatically unwrap your UVs in a second UV channel for this for the shadow baking. Yeah, again, if that all sounds a bit complicated and you want to learn more, then it's probably best to Google that. The other thing that can sometimes not work is you might be able to see through objects, because basically the face, there's been an error when it's imported it and the face is facing the wrong way, so you're being able to see through the back of the face. If that happens, what you can do is select the object that it's happened to. It hasn't happened in this case, but I'll just show you where the setting is. Click on the Details tab, and then we want to scroll down to the Lighting, and under this Light Mask Settings, we want to open that up and put Use Two-Sided Lighting. And then also down here we want to say Shadow Two-Sided. So this is just going to mean that both sides of an object's face, or both sides of a face of an object are going to be treated as if they're solid, rather than being able to see through the back of a face. Yeah, so I hope that's helpful. If you've got any questions, please leave them in the comments below and I'll try and answer. And I hope you get on well with importing your own models.